Today's topic is aquatic life zones, and we are going to concentrate on mainly the marine life zones today. So join me and my friends in our aquatic ecosystem as we talk about each of these. So the freshwater ecosystems that we will talk about later in this unit are ponds and lakes, streams and rivers, and also inland wetlands. Usually we don't consider wetlands a lot of time as being freshwater, but we do have those in addition to our marine or saltwater wetlands. So we'll be talking about estuaries and coastal wetlands in our saltwater ecosystems, intertidal zones, which are found along coastlines, and coastal marshes. Mangrove swamps are another type of coastline that we will look at as well. And then of course we can't leave out our open ocean. In the ocean, we'll look at coral reefs, pelagic zone, and benthos, or the ocean bottom. All right, so any type of aquatic life zone, whether saltwater or freshwater, has organisms. Those that drift, that can't swim along their own, they just move along with the currents, we refer to as plankton. They can be anything as small as microscopic plants and algae and cyanobacteria, all the way up to our larger jellyfish, which are considered a type of zooplankton. Those are our animals. So not all plankton are microscopic as most people believe. Nectid are those type of organisms that can swim on their own. They can swim against the current, so fish, turtles, whales, sharks, anything that can swim. And benthos are those that live on the bottom. Either they attach, like barnacles and oysters, or they can move around, like lobsters and crabs. And then, as in all types of ecosystems, we're going to have our decomposers, the bacteria that break down the dead organic material. All right, so our marine or saltwater life zones cover about 71% of Earth's surface. There are limiting factors that affect the type of organisms that can live in each area, and those are temperature, their access to sunlight, and a big one is the dissolved oxygen content. Different types of organisms need different levels of dissolved oxygen. You can see from the chart here on the right side of the screen different types of organisms that can be found at different levels of dissolved oxygen. And then, as always, we have our need of nutrients. Our primary producers need nitrogen and phosphorus for their processes, and then they pass those through the food chain. Salinity is another limiting factor in our saltwater life zones, and salinity just refers to the salt concentration. Salinity varies anywhere from 33 to 38 parts per thousand. And that's just a ratio. I can say for every 1,000 teaspoons of ocean water, there's 33 teaspoons of salt, or gallons, or tons, however you decide to measure that, it's parts per thousand. So some of the things that can increase salinity are anything that removes water. So if you have the formation of icebergs or sea ice, the freshwater freezes, leaving the salt behind. But then the opposite, if the icebergs or sea ice melt, then that can decrease salinity because you're adding fresh water back in. At the mouth of the river, like our picture here at the bottom right, that's adding fresh water, so that would create a lower salinity. If you're in a hot area that leads to a lot of evaporation, only the water evaporates, leaving the solid salt behind, that would increase salinity. All right, temperature varies on a couple of things. It varies with latitude. We talked about how the sun is more direct at the equator than it is at the poles. But it also depends on depth. In this diagram here, you can see around the equator our temperatures are the highest, and they cool down as you move closer to the poles. With depth in ocean water, sunlight can penetrate down to about 300 meters, and we refer to that 300-meter mark as the thermocline. Therm meaning heat, and that's where there's a rapid change or decline in temperature. So if you look at this first graph here, the low latitude, so that's around your equator. Once you get down to about 300 meters, you have a sharp decline in temperature until you reach a steady cold temperature. Notice that it never gets quite down to freezing, which is why the the water on the ocean floor is not frozen, it's still liquid. At the high latitudes, at our poles, we don't have warm surface water because the sunlight is not as direct, so there is no thermocline. It's the same cold temperature regardless of depth. So in the tropic areas, you've got that warm surface water. It tends to be nutrient depleted. As organisms die and decay, they sink to the bottom, so the bottom water is going to be more nutrient rich. All right, along the coastlines, our first type of aquatic ecosystems are the estuaries. These are areas that are partially enclosed. So you can see here along the coast of North Carolina, we have our outer banks, which enclose our sounds in between the islands here and the mainland. And so this is where our rivers, like the Cape Fear, the Neuse River, freshwater meets that saltwater, and areas that are protected by the waves from those outer banks. So we get a lot of nutrients that are running off of the land, so it's highly productive. We've got a lot of primary productivity. So one thing that varies in this area is salinity. During high tide, when the ocean water is a little bit higher, you're going to have higher salinity. Low tide, you're going to have more fresh water. Estuaries, because they are so nutrient rich and there's so much primary productivity, these are known as marine nurseries. Many of the juvenile fishes and other organisms are going to be in these areas. So that's part of why it's important that we protect our estuaries. And one of the things that is happening in North Carolina, we've talked about our hog farms in the eastern part of the state, is causing eutrophication, and that's really affecting these fish nurseries. Once the fish mature a little bit, then they migrate out into the open ocean. So if we aren't protecting our estuaries, then we aren't in turn protecting our fisheries, and that harms our fishing industry and gives us less food to feed our growing population. Coastal marshes are covered with water either all or part of the year. Usually they're going to be underwater during high tide, and maybe during low tide they're exposed. They tend to have grasses that can live in salty water. They're on the land side of the barrier islands, so they're also protected. They're not going to have as big of a tidal range as you would on the coast. But during high tide, like I said, they're underwater. And then low tide, you get what are called mud flats. These are also very productive. That constant movement of the tide stirs up that silt, which is very nutrient rich. Mangrove swamps are found along coastlines. Mangroves are trees that have an interesting root system, and you can see in both of these pictures the roots actually grow downward from the branches, and they grow along the surface, so they provide protection from erosion. We see these in a lot of tropical areas in the intertidal zone. So the picture on the right, you can see during high tide the roots are underwater, but during low tide they're exposed. So they provide a lot of protection for these coastlines and coral reefs that are attached to the coastlines as well. So a lot of aquatic species live in these areas. What we have seen though is a lot of our mangrove swamps have been destructed. About 35% have been cleared since the 80s for growing crops. The intertidal zone, inter means between, so between tides, it's where the land meets the sea. So high tide it would be exposed to water, low tide exposed to air. So the organisms that live here are adapted to those conditions, constant changes between wet and dry and between levels of salinity. Some of our intertidal zones have rocky coasts that are constantly pounded by waves. And so the species that we have live in the tidal pools. Now on sandy shores like we have in North Carolina, the organisms, instead of living in these little pools, burrow down into the sand. So worms, clams, crabs, even our little flounder here that can burrow himself into the sand. But the waves keep that mud and sand constantly moving. So you don't see as many plants here because it's hard to adapt to that constantly changing conditions. Sand dunes are also one of the first lines of defense against the sea. They help protect anything behind it. They protect from wind, they protect from wave damage, so that helps with erosion. Now some coastlines like North Carolina have barrier islands, so we see that along our coast. This picture right here is on the Gulf Coast of Texas. These are the Padre Islands. But they're long, thin offshore islands. They're made basically of sand. And they're constantly shifting because as the ocean moves, it picks up the sand and carries it with the currents. So the islands are drifting and moving, especially with large storms and hurricanes. We see a lot of erosion of the barrier islands. Coral reefs are also found near coastlines. Some are, but very few are found in the middle of the ocean. But they tend to be in coastal waters of the tropics and subtropics. So you have to have clear water and it has to be warm. Currents and waves are constantly bringing nutrients, so we have a lot of living organisms. Coral reefs are the equivalent of tropical rainforest when we're talking about biodiversity in terms of ecosystems. And what coral is, it's an organism that creates its own skeleton out of calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is also the mineral that makes up limestone. So when a coral dies, it leaves that skeleton behind and it builds upon the reef, and the reef gets larger. New polyps come along attached to the old coral. They'll make their own skeletons, and so gradually the reef grows in size. Now, coral reefs are vulnerable because they do grow so slowly. They're very easily disrupted if there's changes in water quality or water temperature, because it has to be very clear, it has to be warm. They also need a very high salinity. So if any of that is affected, even an increase in temperature can cause what we call coral bleaching. It's called bleaching because when you no longer have living polyps, then all you have is the bare limestone. It's not going to be as colorful as we usually associate with a coral reef. There's three types of coral reefs. If it's attached to the land, extending from the shore, those are called fringing reefs. Barrier reefs are separated from the land, like the Great Barrier Reef along the coast of Australia. And then atolls are those that are found in the open ocean. They're what used to be volcanoes that have since gone extinct and have begun to erode. And you still have coral that's along the top of the seamount. The body of water in the middle of that is called a lagoon. All right, in the open ocean, we have various life zones. So starting at the coastline, the continent extends out before it drops off to the ocean floor. This is called the continental shelf. Where it drops is the continental slope. And you can see off of the Atlantic coast how far out that continental shelf extends. Now, during a period of global warming, it's underwater. During an ice age, it's exposed. So our ocean life zones, you can see our intertidal zones are along that continental shelf. The euphotic zone or photic zone is where the light extends. That goes down to about 300 meters. The benthic zone is anywhere along the bottom of the ocean. The abyssal plain is that deep ocean floor. Then the pelagic zone is the open ocean where we have most of our large fish. So most of the ocean is the pelagic. That's the ocean water, that open ocean. It's generally cold. On average, it's hard to come up with a temperature range because if you're closer to the equator, the surface is warm. If you're closer to the poles, the surface is cooler. But these are our large predatory fish. The upper part of that, as I said, was the euphotic zone, photo meaning light. So that's where we're going to have our producers. A lot of that is phytoplankton, but what you see in this picture here is a kelp forest. Not many nutrients because the nutrients sink to the bottom. We do have high levels of dissolved oxygen because of the photosynthesis. That once we get closer to that 300-meter depth where it's very dimly lit, that's the bathal zone. We do have some smaller fish and our zooplankton in this area. Benthos is the bottom. Now in the intertidal zone and on the continental shelf, the sunlight is going to reach the bottom. But in the abyssal zone, sunlight does not. And also these organisms have to adapt to high pressure. So these are organisms that if they swam to the surface, their bodies would basically expand and pop because they need the pressure to hold their bodies together. The organisms are also adapted to very low dissolved oxygen. However, the amount of nutrients on the ocean floor is enough to support 98% of all species because of that dead decaying matter. However, most species cannot survive in those cold, high pressure, low dissolved oxygen situations. In the next module, we will look at our freshwater ecosystems.